Today, I spoke with Alex Petropoulos, Chief of Staff of the Arq Foundation and one of the co-authors of Europe 2031, a scenario which lays bare what getting AI wrong will mean for Europe's future. The scenario has awoken Europe at the highest levels. Olivier Blanchard, former chief economist of the IMF, called it a must-read. It's also being read by members of parliament, and Alex told me that one European politician, after listening to the audio version of Europe 2031, broke down in tears. Europe does not have a frontier model like those of Anthropic and OpenAI, and it only has 5% of the world's compute, which are necessary for both training and serving AI models. And so, in a world where the United States and China both have dominant leads on AI, where does that leave Europe? Is Europe's only option to become a vassal state of the United States, begging for access to AI models and forced to have its own future determined by Americans? In this interview, Alex and I discussed the Europe 2031 scenario, his own work at the Arq Foundation, and what AI policy options are available to give Europe leverage over its own future. So I'm very excited to discuss Europe 2031, but a good place to start is probably the foundation behind it. So what is Arq and what sort of change is it hoping to affect in Europe?
So Arq, or Arq Foundation, is a new philanthropically funded think tank based in Brussels. Our headline mission is prepare Europe and the world for transformative AI. That's pretty vague. The main three things that we focus on is sort of maintaining Europe's agency in the AI transition, improving Europe's resilience, and improving its flourishing. And then to do that, we have 5 main programmatic themes, focus areas: accelerating the build-out of AI infrastructure in Europe, doing research into what AI middle power coalitions can look like, accelerating resilience-enhancing technologies, broad-based breakthrough innovation acceleration, sort of meta-science flavored, and then lastly, statecraft, improving state capacity in the places that it matters most within governments.
Terrific. I want to definitely dig into several of those. Can you tell me how Arq came about and the composition of the team?
Yeah, so Arq is a spin-out from a previous think tank called the Center for Future Generations. Most of us were on the AI team there, and we basically decided that AI, it was an emerging technology policy think tank, and we decided that AI was moving at a pace that required a dedicated organization that could operate at the pace and the focus needed to all work on this one thing. And so that's how you sort of end up with 8 founding members, all starting April 2026. So been sort of operational for 2 months. I'd say we're still very much we're in an interesting position where you're starting up something new, but you're also continuing all of your old policy engagement work and all your old files and you active things you're doing whilst you're trying to hire and build out an org and set up office space and all that. So it's definitely a lot of work.
I see. Yeah, hopefully we get you some positive attention here. One of the 5 pillars you mentioned was middle power coordination. And so there is that coordination within Europe or even across the world with other middle powers?
Definitely the second case. So we tend to have a view that, and we can get into later why we think that there needs to be an AI middle power coalition. But we think that trying to go through the EU would introduce a lot of veto points and delays that you wouldn't get much for in return. And so the best version of this AI middle power coalition is to start with countries that actually have meaningful things to offer, like the UK, Canada, South Korea, Japan, and then pair those with a select coalition of the willing European countries that also have relevance here. France, Germany, the Netherlands. And so you start with that Europe plus middle power grouping. And then maybe you can grow from there if you wish.
Yeah, I'd love to discuss more about how that comes to exist, what it looks like, and what the barriers would be. But I want to continue on to the very exciting essay that you guys have put out. So the Europe 2031 essay sort of paints a pessimistic or negative vision of what failing to deal with AI in an appropriate way looks like for Europe. Why did you guys write this essay, and why write it as, let's say, a scenario rather than a policy paper?
So I should point out that this is written by two of the co-authors on this essay, are Arq employees, and it's also funded in part by Arq. But it's not just an Arq project. There are 6 other co-authors all working across VC and other think tanks. So we can't claim, sole credit. But to get to your actual question, Europe 2031 is a scenario about a plausible AI future under for some conservative, for some accelerated sort of pace of AI capabilities that sort of basically predicts that if Europe continues on its what we see as a default path of interventions, it sort of falls into this quite gloomy, quite depressing, I've been told, outcome where Europe is basically forced to choose between vassalage of either the US or China, and loses its sovereignty and its autonomy and its ability to shape its own future. And we wanted to tell this as a story because we're inspired by other previous scenarios like AI 2027, situational awareness, read by Ivanka Trump, right? Read by, I'm sure, many more. There's this sense in which the US sort of is woken up to AGI, sort of has woken up, and our goal was twofold. First, to sort of have this reach European elites and sort of wake them up to the urgency and the stakes involved, and then at the same time point them in what we think is the right direction to prevent this bad outcome from happening.
Have you seen that desired effect take place? Like, are the right elites reading Europe 2031?
Yes.
Okay. No, that's terrific.
I don't think I'd be able to say anything more.
All right.
I mean, what I can say is from things people who have publicly shared, we've had tons of public endorsements and support, ranging from figures influential in technology. So you've got like Matt Clifford, and you've got various VCs and tech leaders, also academics, also civil society. We've also had private people privately reaching out to us, saying that they've read it, and so we're quite happy with the results. We have to keep pushing though.
No, that's terrific. One of the things that occurs in the scenario is there's a hypothetical frontier inference services rule that's put into place in 2029 in response to a hypothetical compute shortage, which occurs. And so the idea is that Washington / the American AI industry decides to privilege American firms or American industry over Europe. And very recently, we had this episode with Fable and Mythos being pulled, with the ostensible reason for it being security concerns, and the government's ostensible sort of mandate was that foreign nationals are not allowed to access Fable / Mythos. So this excludes even Andre Karpathy. Do you sort of see this as being in line with dynamics in your scenario, either ahead of time, or is this something kind of orthogonal, just an erratic behavior by the Trump administration? How do you think of this recent episode?
It's definitely related. I'll throw on a massive asterisk that I think that it seems that the particularities of this case seem to smell more like the administration has beef with Anthropic than a genuine sort of we want to restrict access to foreign from foreign usage. However, what this is for me is a sort of very strong evidence point, and hopefully an evidence point for European leaders and policymakers that the US government has this capacity to switch off your access within, 3 hours notice.
Yeah.
And so while this individual case isn't, I think, sort of perfectly fitting with what we described, it is perfectly telling the story that we wanted to tell, which is this is really urgent. Your frontier access is by no means guaranteed, and you should care about that a lot and be taking decisions now so that when we are in the future and we are in a hypothetical compute crunch or in another situation where the US might want to restrict access, you have the ability to negotiate and say, maybe not.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then I agree that it's very useful to you guys as a call to action. I guess the question is which particular action, and that's maybe the entire idea of both Arq and the year of 2031 scenario. And so I listened to you on the, I think, ETN podcast yesterday or a few days ago, and one of the things that's posited in year of 2031 is the idea of trying to build a frontier model, but too late. I think in the ETN clip, you mentioned there being maybe an up to 10% chance that Europe is able to build a competitive frontier model. Do you think that that's still worth trying? Is that wasted energy? Is that, one of the actions that you'd hope to be taken as a result of Fable/Mythos?
I mean, Europe is a really big continent, so there's lots we can do, and so I think we can and should try. But indeed, I complete number pulled out of nowhere. But to get my sort of hunch, 10%, and I think a lot of that 10% is in fact trying some alternate paradigms and trying to like moonshot your way or sort of catapult yourself past the frontier. I think the people who are trying to compete bar for bar with exactly what Anthropic or OpenAI are doing, like even less bullish. So we should try those things, but they should only make up a really small fraction of what you do to try and secure access to frontier capabilities. I think that the much more robust solution is to build up a pool of leverage, a pool of strategic indispensability that then you can use to negotiate frontier access. That for me is the positive future for Europe that doesn't require getting lucky.
What are, let's say, some of those main pillars, those alternative strategies?
So if we look at the current leverage points that exist, we'll go back to this middle power coalition. And you can say that the Netherlands has ASML. South Korea has almost a monopoly on high bandwidth memory. Japan has the bulk share of semiconductor construction capabilities. Canada and France, they have abundant energy resources that you could use to build data centers. The UK has a bunch of AI talent. And so all of these by themselves are quite insignificant points of leverage. But if you pulled them together, you could sort of combine yourself a sort of, an arsenal, a flotilla of different leverage points that are sort of robust against different future timelines and give you a stronger negotiating position. Now, even in the long term, I don't think this is robust, and even in the short term, this might not be enough. And so you've also got to do a lot more to build out leverage. in general, each country in Europe has to be asking itself, like, what is my comparative advantage? So, like, the Netherlands should probably just go and try and make ASML and the surrounding ecosystem super competitive, grow really faster. Example I sometimes use is Portugal. They have lots of transatlantic cables that all run through the Atlantic, and they end up in Portugal. And so maybe Portugal should go and construct a bunch of the vessels you can use for transatlantic cable repair and monitoring. This is an example of individual leverage that a country can sort of say, what is my comparative advantage? What can I do here to become more important on AI? But by and large, the one thing that seems to be pretty free lunch in terms of like building up leverage, or at least reducing the relative leverage of the US, is for more countries in Europe to build compute, to expand their share of the data center supply. Currently, Europe has 5%, to the US's 75%. If there were a bunch of supply side reforms, we think that Europe could get up to a 20% share within a few years.
Interesting. What are those supply side reforms?
So in many cases, it's building much more energy. Our industrial energy prices are far too high. It's lowering time to power, so the amount of time it takes from when something gets built to be connected to the grid. In many cases, if you're a data center operator, this is actually the most expensive part for you. You're willing to pay a lot more for the energy, but you just want to get building really quickly because every hour wasted is just millions down the drain. That being said, in many other cases, it might be that data center operators want some sort of guarantee that you won't sort of turn around and try and appropriate their data center. And so a lot of it is talking to operators and being like, what do you need? In general, these are broad supply side reforms that Europe should be making more broadly, building out more energy, making their grids more robust and more flexible.
Are these reforms that can be made unilaterally by European countries, or does it require like full EU coordination?
I think a lot of this can be done unilaterally by individual countries. A lot of this can be done by setting up dedicated permitting zones, data center acceleration zones, special compute zones, what do you want to call them. There are some European files, directives, regulations that might apply across Europe, possibly relating to environmental regulation and whatnot. Those might have to be changed centrally. But there is a lot that individuals can do. And even if you look at individual countries, so we can talk about like grid curtailment. This is where you give a data center operator, you say, look, our grid capacity is full. However, we can plug you in if you agree that we sometimes turn off your data center when demand gets too high. And if you do this, you basically unlock an extra 50% of grid capacity. It's really big. Many countries in Europe don't do this at all. They don't even offer it as an option on the table. And so there's a really large gap in terms of like level of ambition and realizing this is a thing that you can try to optimize for. And so this is why we sort of think this is a very fast way for European countries building up leverage over the upstream AI supply chain.
Yes, that makes sense. And then I guess one of the other pillars that you mentioned was the creation of, let's say, a political/cultural environment in which the hyperscalers don't feel that their capital is going to be expropriated, or that they're going to be subject to enormous taxes. I guess how could you see Europe committing to that? Do you think that like that sort of future capital expropriation is something preventing investment right now?
You sometimes hear it. I think the biggest bottleneck here is Europe being willing to make the trade-off itself. It's not necessarily even the case of American data center operators, hyperscalers, not being willing to move in. Often you sometimes hear people saying, we don't want them to build here. We want European hyperscalers instead. And I think there's a sense of trade-offs that have to be made of, okay, you might lose some perception of sovereignty here by letting these American firms take up your market share and build out. But in return, you're getting a much more important piece of sovereignty, which is access to frontier capabilities.
Yeah.
And so you have to be willing to take that trade-off.
Yeah, that makes sense. wanted to come back to the year of 2031 scenario. One thing I found interesting about it is that it starts in January 2025. Was there a decision or a reason to choose that particular starting point?
I think starting with I think the chapter is DeepSeek, and you can find starting with the DeepSeek cope, the sort of this Brussels moment of DeepSeek shows that the Americans aren't that far ahead. We can catch up with open models if we want to. This sort of builds up to a few assumptions that we felt were foundational for why Europe has gone wrong. Assumptions that Europe sort of has grossly miscalibrated where AI is going, sort of the end position, grossly miscalibrated how easy it is to catch up, and grossly miscalibrated how close we are in terms of catching up and just how far we're falling behind. And so starting there lets us tell, I feel, a quite strong story about these are the mistakes or the misassumptions that locally might be understandable, but then when you zoom out, you're like, oh, we're cooked.
Yeah. That makes sense. I guess the other alternative starting point that I thought could have made sense is the EU AI Act. I don't know if it played a big role in this scenario. Is that something that you would see in a good path or a positive vision needing to be rolled back, changed? Is it fine as is? How do you think of the AI Act?
So the reason the AI Act didn't really come up in the scenario is because of the fact that we think that it will become less important over time because Europe's leverage and market share will become less important over time. And so you can't enforce your regulations just matter less. This is your source of leverage is not relevant. In terms of a good branch, a good scenario for Europe, I think that there are lots of parts of the AI Act that you'd want to change, especially around the high-risk sections. There are other things that might be even more important, though, which we could get into. I think there are possibly some bigger fish on the table that you want to tackle. AI Act definitely looks like, especially the high-risk sections, quite bad in terms of adoption and letting Europe benefit from AI.
Yeah, I guess like if you had to prioritize over the, you can only have political will for a certain number of things at a time, which are, let's say, the highest leverage actions that Europe can take on sort of the dual axes of maximum potential to push forward Europe's AI future and politically feasible. Like, are on that frontier, like which sort of things stick out?
I had a bunch to say, and then you said politically feasible, and I shut my mouth.
We can start with one axis.
I think that the compute might be feasible. I think it's sounding like, so there's already a technology sovereignty package that is going through the European Commission, and it's now sitting with the Parliament and the Council. And within this, they sort of lay an ambition to increasing Europe's relevance in compute, and they see this as a big thing. So the political ambition is there. It's just the scale of the ambition isn't matched. So I think this is something that you can change quite quickly. In general, your broad view should be make Europe competitive at technology, which is a politically stated ambition from all European leaders. The question is, like, are you willing to make the trade-offs to make that happen? And so in many member states, in many countries, labor laws might come in as a place where we're currently uncompetitive on technology. Firms aren't able to be as dynamic and aren't able to take risks on hiring and pivot because of stringent labor laws. And this is a place where I think countries like France, the Netherlands, Germany are particularly vulnerable, both now in terms of being competitive on technology, but then also AI is probably going to increase the returns to dynamism, punish those countries even more. And so then you should be quite worried about those. The political economy of fixing labor laws in those countries is incredibly costly.
Is there a precedent for European labor laws getting weaker in the 20th century?
Yeah, countries tend to sort of go through these cycles, and they tend to fix them. In the past, multiple of these countries have. a good example is Denmark. They sort of have a European compromise to labor laws, which is a flexicurity model. This model was first introduced to me. I read a piece by Peter Garicano in Works in Progress called "Why Europe Doesn't Have a Tesla." And the premise of this model is you make a deal with the workers. And you say, we're going to make it incredibly easy to hire and fire you. However, in return, you're going to get generous unemployment protections. You're going to get an insurance that means that if you're fired, you're covered by the state for 2 years, as long as you're seeking new employment. And so you have maybe a best of both worlds in terms of European values and wanting a strong social safety net, but also in wanting to have this dynamism in your firms. And so Peter will argue that this is why Denmark is able to have a super competent and successful technology company like Novo Nordisk that can develop GLP-1 inhibitor drugs. That I think is possibly a positive vision. I've talked to my lefty friends, and the mention of Denmark sort of soothes their latent fears about me talking about reforming labor laws, and so I'm bullish.
I see. So they could be content with that kind of outcome, and then that's probably not going to be pivotal to allowing Europe to create a competitive frontier model. But we're thinking about sort of we're thinking about the possibility set quite outside of that. There's lots of other capabilities complementary to the frontier model that you could develop, and some reform of these labor laws in line with what you discussed will be necessary for that.
Yeah, this alongside getting good at technology is useful for many different strategies. So you might have your might put 10% of your resources into developing a front-end model. This will be useful for that. You want to be relevant in the upstream supply chain. You want to build out your compute. You want to make your semi strategy good. That's technology again. You got to get good at that. Another source of leverage we didn't talk about is getting really good at what comes after AI, and sort of taking a hedge on, okay, there will be many important technologies that follow from AI or enabled by it: fusion, photonics, robotics. Make it such that the multi-trillion dollar company that is really good at those is based in your borders. And so again, get good at technology. You're not going to be able to have a competitive one of those firms you're unlikely to if you've got these stringent labor laws.
Yeah.
And so getting good at technology is useful across the board in terms of building up your leverage and holding onto your agency in the face of, a predicted future.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. I wanted to talk about ASML in particular. So I've been learning more and more about ASML in the last few weeks. They produce this photolithography machine, which is used to print out every advanced chip in the world. And part of what you've, I think, mentioned at some times in your ideas for what a positive vision for Europe looks like is creating a better environment for, or being more supportive of ASML. So I sort of have two questions. Like, how should we think of ASML relative to other points of leverage that Europe has? Is it Europe's most important leverage? And then what does being more supportive of it actually look like? Is that something that would come from the Dutch government? Is that something that would come from Europe?
So in terms of leverage and how you should think about ASML, it might be Europe's most important point. Definitely now. I think in the future it won't be. So a couple of things to consider with leverage. Leverage points might become more or less important at certain points in time. So currently, ASML isn't the bottleneck to producing chips, and so it is a lot less important. In the future, it might become the bottleneck. It's expected to become the bottleneck in about 2 years. That might be the point where ASML is most important.
And it being the bottleneck means there's demand for more chips now.
Yeah.
Or there's expected demand for more chips in the future, but ASML cannot make all the photolithography machines for that expected demand in the future. Like, it can't commit to that.
Yeah, the supply is I forgot the term. The supply can't quickly change to meet the demand.
Yeah.
Um, and equally, in the future, ASML could become a lot less important. There could be a new technology that comes out, or a rival competitor, a Chinese semi-lithography firm that outcompetes. And so you want to collect these points of leverage that are useful at different points in time. Another thing to think about when it comes to ASML, people often talk about the fact that whilst it's a mostly European company, there are some parts of the ASML machines that are made in America. So it's not like you could just completely start producing chips or chip machines, rather, only in Europe for Europe. The Americans have a veto point. In general, when it comes to thinking about leverage, my preferred way of thinking about this is saying, okay, Europe has +3 leverage points, or maybe has 3 veto points. And America currently has about 15. And then when you're 3 versus 15, the 15 dominates. The 15 can basically ask for whatever it wants, can slap you about and say, your 3 doesn't matter. And so the goal for Europe is to get into a position where that's more like 6 versus 9. And so it's not that you use a veto point, it's that you solve for the equilibrium. And you basically say, okay, where does this leave me in terms of negotiating power and what I can ask for?
Got it. And then what would, let's say, being more supportive of ASML to the extent that, at least now and possibly in the future, it is an important source of veto points for Europe, what does being more supportive of it look like?
Not a full expert on this, but from some stories I've been told, ASML currently can't really expand in the Netherlands because the grid is at capacity. They exist in quite a small region, Eindhoven, and there just aren't enough houses there for them to bring in new researchers. There isn't enough grid capacity for them to expand their new buildings. The Netherlands introduced this €3 billion package to save ASML after they warned that they might leave the country because they were too constrained. And that package, the last time I checked, is still stuck in environmental review. And so this feels like a crazy person situation to be in when you've got one of the most important countries in the companies in the world, and you're not sort of treating this as a 5-alarm fire and putting all your weight behind trying to unblock this company from growing.
So, I mean, if we kind of like think about Project Warp Speed, right, in the United States, and the accelerated timelines that were there for vaccine review, like that COVID sort of was able to create the sense of urgency to roll back or review many of the FDA's policies. So I guess, is there a precedent in Europe for accelerated environmental review, or like, should we just basically infer through the fact that it's stuck there that right now there isn't that urgency, and something like Europe 2031 is trying to change that?
I'm not sure about the particulars of environmental review, and it might be the case that they've managed to get it through recently. I haven't checked in a while. I do think that what you're saying, which is Europe 2031, is trying to be this ideology piece to create the sense of urgency. This is ultimately our goal, and I think that there are, some my friends at Progress Ireland, the think tank, many of whom are EVs. They have this paper out called "Helping Europe Build Again," which is talking about the European environmental rules and a bunch of trade-offs that you could make that would actually be better for the environment, in that wouldn't weaken the environmental standards, but just tweak them in certain ways, but would allow Europe to build a lot more. And so I think that in general, there's a lot more. We aren't at the edge of the distribution, right? There's a lot more that we can climb in terms of win-win solutions. That being said, we do think you have to make a bunch of trade-offs. And so being willing to make a set of narrow trade-offs for a specific use case, if you buy that this is really important for your national sovereignty or your security, your militaries, your defense, these would be rational decisions to take, I think.
If you know about this, I'm curious, is that environmental review coming from Europe or from the Netherlands? Like, where is the sticking point? Do you know?
Netherlands is a bit weird in the case that there is and I'm not an expert on this, so I might get this wrong. There is a European directive that relates to the amount of nitrogen that is allowed to be in the soil. And because the Netherlands has a lot of agriculture, it basically uses up its nitrogen budget, all from the agriculture, which then makes it impossible for it to add in new things. Even if those new things would contribute a tiny amount of nitrogen, they've used up their budget, and so they can't add any more. And so this is a case of one European directive that applies across Europe, but disproportionately affects one European country in a negative way. I don't know if it's the case that the Netherlands have gold-plated this directive in a way, or it might be a regulation, in a way that makes it worse for them. There are people who have looked at this far more than me, but that should get you the gist of something that Europe has done that disproportionately affects one country in a adverse way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think part of the dynamic that you poke at in the Europe 2031 scenario is the idea that it may be individually rational for many countries in the future to defect from the European Union. And so this game theory of creating the right middle power coalition it seems very difficult.
Yes and no. Again, like the coalition doesn't have to come from the EU itself. So the coalition probably should start as a set of countries that are operating outside of that framework. I wouldn't characterize that as defecting from the EU, although I think that the concessions they'd make and the things they do would be broadly good for all of Europe. And then the pitch for other countries would be like, if you want to be in this coalition, you have to become important. You have to bring something to the table. And I think that there's actually a lot you can do in the sense that countries haven't properly sat down and thought, what is my comparative advantage? If I really pushed hard on something, how could I become quite important on this one niche thing that's very important or diminish someone else's leverage point? It's all very zero-sum. And my hope is that it can be, in a limited sense, zero-sum. Well, hopefully positive sum in the sense that many of the reforms you're making will help the wider European economy grow. And then positive sum in the broader sense that there's this sense that if you let one group become too much more powerful than the rest, then they start losing incentives to operate in a positive sum way, where they can dominate. And so the goal is to not have any individual actor so far ahead of everyone else that they lose their incentives to be positive sum, to do collaboration, to sort of act in everyone's interest rather than their own.
Yes, that I guess that makes sense, but like I don't know if it's too. Do you see it as to America or China's advantage to have a strong Europe, or is there, I mean, a sense in which yes, it is zero sum. Like America just wants to beat everybody. Like that is what is good for the United States.
Yeah, I think I have a couple answers to this. One, I think plurality is quite good. Having other opinions, close enough to yours but slightly differing, is a very useful epistemic check on making sure that you have enough ideas pointing in the same direction. You're like, sometimes you will make mistakes, and so having other people who think like you but are slightly different is quite useful in terms of improving your epistemics. I think that would be quite good for America if Europe was by its side, providing that epistemic check and that plurality. On a second point, I think a lot of Americans do just want Europe to succeed and hold a lot of sort of almost empathy for, we were birthplace of democracy. Many Americans can trace their roots back to Europe, and it's quite sad to see a continent in decline. At the same time, many of our enemies are shared enemies. With those of America, that's a very zero-sum way to frame that. We have shared values and shared beliefs, and a largely shared culture. It's often in the difference of the culture where the interesting things happen. And so I just think it probably would be in the interest, both from a plurality R&D trade perspective, but also from like a cultural values perspective, I think the optimal set of values are probably some combination of European and American, up to the listener to decide what weighting they want to throw at that combination.
Yes. Yeah. I agree with that. I don't know if American policy is oriented towards that right now.
Yeah. I would say that Trump and Vance have done incredible things for getting Europe to get back on its own feet and to realize that it was heading in a very bad direction. The US hasn't really contributed to the European decline, hasn't contributed to Europe not realizing that it's on track for irrelevance. And so, if anything, I'm quite grateful for the fact that the US has sort of been a tough love giver.
At like a very basic level.
Yeah, in a decoupling sense, right?
Yeah, one of the levers that you posited Europe has is, allowing for more data centers to be built.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is obviously jointly useful for Europe and the United States, unless like those get, repurposed to build a Chinese frontier model. But hopefully that's not that's a worse than Europe 2031 scenario.
If we get into those scenarios, something else horribly wrong has happened.
One of the parts of the scenario I wanted to discuss was the September 2026 bit, and I found that one interesting because I sort of read the scenario as things that are nearer term are actually like more likely to be on the horizon. There's less uncertainty there. And so we could take this as like a more real immediate risk that is already being discussed. And I'm going to read it off. Like one of the things that's mentioned here is that the headline measure at some, I guess, grand convention, AI convention, is endorsed by France and Germany, is for a digital sovereignty regulation requiring critical public sector workloads to run on 100% European cloud and AI software by 2032. No more American AI, no American clouds. To me, this sounds like a disastrous regulation were it to be in place. And like it's something that you guys posit as coming about in September 2026. So like starting to be proposed then, which I guess implies is being discussed right now. Is this something on the horizon that you guys are pushing against?
Yeah, I can actually read you something out. So in response to the Anthropic situation, France's AI Council met, and they made some assessments. Some of these assessments were good, but then some of these assessments really, I think, capture well the sense in which they think. So to read you a couple quotes. Particular vigilance will be needed regarding the actual allocation of compute capacity, which, if it were to flow to primarily American giants, would do nothing to address digital sovereignty or the capture of value produced. Additionally, in parallel and closely related, we've been witnessing for several months a strong resurgence of the doctrine of catastrophic, even existential risk associated with AI. Analogies with nuclear technology and deterrence are multiplying, as is hostility towards open models, a position shared by the US government and figures such as Jeffrey Hinton, who was in Paris last week. This approach is a well-known playbook initiated by big tech, a claim that only a handful of actors should possess the most advanced technologies on account of their supposed danger, an assertion far from scientific consensus. And then lastly, as European businesses and public administration prepare to deploy AI use cases at scale and commit significant investment to doing so, any engagement with a private actor, particularly an American one, must henceforth be entered into with full awareness of the constraints and concrete risks this episode has brought to light. So they're sort of making lots of claims in a very protectionist manner. They want to, they're sort of hinting at wanting to restrict the use of any compute built in Europe only for European companies.
Yeah.
They're sort of saying for any compute to be built, you should be incredibly skeptical if it were American hyperscalers building this compute. This is the France's AI Council, basically their council of AI advisors.
Yeah, I guess like in this race, like you're only able to have this kind of protectionist policy if you're in the lead. If you're
Yeah.
not in the lead, then you can't do it, right? So the United States has an analog to this protectionist policy in the form of chip export controls.
Yeah.
So like we don't send our chips to China. We can do that because we're winning and maybe, let's say, likely to win, whatever
Yeah.
winning means.
Although it's back and forth, right? Like we are sending some of our chips to China. The US is sending some of its chips to China.
Some of its chips, yeah.
Those I can see arguments on both sides in the sense of like sending those chips helps China catch up versus being protectionist enables the creation of a domestic Chinese economy. I think on the margin, I would interpret the US is actually doing the opposite of that. But when it comes to the French reactions, maybe to contextualize some of them, Mistral, who is France's champion, is really struggling with compute. They can't raise enough money to be able to rent out enough compute because you need to rent out like 5-year compute contracts, which is incredibly expensive. Yeah. Otherwise, you get outcompeted by the American labs. And so they're struggling to get access to the compute, which is where you see these calls for like, what if we had European compute and it was reserved only for European companies? And so from a locally optimizing perspective, I empathize with French policymakers because they don't have much they can do here. The reason Mistral maybe can't raise that much is because there is an assumed cap to their growth potential that is probably downstream from European reasons, like fragmentation of single market and bad regulations in a broad sense. And a French policymaker doesn't maybe have the ability to respond. But what's good for France is probably not what's good for Europe in this regard.
What's good for France is probably not what's good for Europe in this regard, in the sense that
the protectionism would hurt Europe overall. We should focus much more on doing the other things I've been talking about rather than trying to prop up a national champion.
Yes, that makes sense. One topic I wanted to talk to you about is, let's say, public communication or communication to policymakers and the difficulty of it. Europe 2031 is excellently written. It took me work to read it. Like it's not easy to read, right?
No.
Like I had to read it 3 times in order to like start to get my head around it. And I'm not a total novice to this space, but
you have context.
I have some context, and it still makes it difficult. So how do you guys sort of think about both, the type of telephone game that's occurring between you, somebody who reads it, and then, getting to the point of the person who's in power, making this, like, if you had to reduce, I guess one approach may be to reduce Europe 2031 to a catchphrase or something like that. Yeah. How do you think about this kind of scientific AI communication?
Yeah. So there is a summary page, which possibly helps. Another thing that has really helped has been the audio version. And so when it comes to senior policymaker reception, for what we've heard in private, I would say 90% of the most senior engagement we've got has all been via the audio version.
Interesting.
So they're all listening to the audio version. They'll go on their cycle, they'll go for their run. This is time where they will just be listening to something. And I think it's structured in a way where it doesn't necessarily feel like work when you're listening to it. It's a story, and so like ultimately humans are storytellers and listen to stories, and so you're able to internalize the scenario. You're able to internalize what's at stake, and in many cases we've had people reach out to us being like, I started crying at the end. I got emotional. Credits to Tom Chivers, who does the narration and the writing for the scenario.
That's fascinating. I wouldn't have thought of either the story structure or audio as being so pivotal and so important, but given, let's say, the level of importance of this issue like Europe's AI strategy and the types of people who you've hinted at are listening to it. These are, not the story structure, like that takes work, but audio, that's a pretty low effort. I mean, though I guess if you're having a narrator of this whole thing, like explicitly, that's different, but you can 11 labs it too. That's a pretty low effort addition that, any policy organization can put out that they may not be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I will also say that like there are two stages to any policy engagement. I describe it as the boulder over the hill problem. You must push the policy boulder up to the top of the hill, and then the boulder will start rolling down the hill. And you've got to be really on your ball to make sure that that boulder does not run over some house of people and does not crash into a village and does not end up in the wrong direction. Because once the political machine grabs onto something, that then picks up momentum and it can easily drift in a direction that is suboptimal or is just bad. And so there is like the two part of this is like you put out something like this and then you do a lot of active policy engagement, and you talk and you ideally the main purpose of Europe 2031 is not just to reach elites but to seed a field of policy professionals, think tanks, operators, organizations, community builders, funders, who will exist around this set of ideas and other sets of ideas that are similar, and then be able to operate all under a same shared language, under a shared same goal. That's the machine, or the ideas machine that you're trying to create.
Yes. No, makes perfect sense. I'm curious what Arq's plans or strategies are in coming months. Are they more adaptive based on what the reception to Europe 2031 or other efforts would be? Or do you kind of have a defined set of things that you are trying to do?
So not as adaptive as you'd think, in the sense that many of the things we were working on are already things that Europe 2031 calls for. This is a mutually reinforcing like document ideology. It's like built into our strategy, and we wrote our strategy as we were writing the scenario. And so I say the documents are sister documents almost at this point, because of how much, how many tokens were spent between each other, to each other. In terms of like direct strategy, I would say that we're probably going to be scaling up our AI infrastructure people. We're like fundraising for that now, and so we'll scale up the compute build outs, the semi build out side of the organization, and the middle power stuff. That's the stuff that matters in the most short term. In the long term, I'm quite bullish on like the R&D stuff being quite important for Europe to get right, in the sense of this is how you get your long term leverage, by actually being good at the technology. Once again, I was going to say for once, Europe used to be really good at technology. There were lots of amazing technologies that were developed on this continent.
Oh, yeah.
And so getting back to that position seems quite important. I just say that my sense is I approach this really from a field building perspective, and not just the case of like what can Arq do, but like what can Arq do to help the field grow around us. And like now we're going to probably be one of the larger organizations in Europe doing this sort of stuff. And so what can we do to like leave room and like make sense for like, I want there to be orgs like us. We're in Brussels. We act as a sort of a central European hub. We multiply into Brussels and multiply out into different member states. I want there to be orgs being set up in Paris, in Belgrade, Paris, Berlin, Madrid, all across Europe. We need people who are being operators, who are sort of turning the idea into, praxis. Make it happen, I guess. So I think there's some amount of our ambition has grown to support the field and not just ourselves.
Given what little I can glean of the reception on Twitter, like I would say active in the community of Twitter economists, I would guess that you've done a good job at pushing in that direction. You obviously have a much more accurate view on how things will go, but
we got a very nice tweet from who was it?
You got nice tweets from everybody.
But there was one French economist in particular that was quite useful for.
Olivier Blanchard, I think.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Was he the head of the European Central Bank at some point? I forget. But he's a famous dude. So yeah, that was a very nice tweet.
Yeah, I don't know if I can get away with saying this, but I will. French Parisians especially can be quite snobby, and so having someone like that definitely helps in the sense of giving permission to a community to like talk about a topic. Unless you have someone who is his senior, who is politically above you talking about a topic, you might not feel you have cultural permission to discuss something that is objectively quite weird.
I could see that. A few final questions.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I'm curious about is just what the writing process was like. Like, is this a document? I mean, it's a scenario, so it's fictional, but was it like usually, let's say, pieces of fiction aren't typically written by a committee of 7 people. Is this scenario something that got unanimity, like in terms of agreeing with how things would be laid out? Is there still, like, in the end, a very wide range of opinions on what this scenario should have looked like?
There's a wide range of opinions. I don't think there's a wide range in what it should have looked like. I will say there were, in fact, 8 authors. One of the co-authors didn't originally list, but they now have listed. They couldn't list originally. And so, yeah, so coordinating amongst 8 people. So I think the process started from aligning on what story we wanted to tell. Do we want to tell a positive or negative story? Aligning on what we think the things you need to fix and the things Europe needs to fix are. We had a whole writing retreat in somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Germany to discuss this and sort of iterate on what that was. Then, Google Doc iterate many times. There were so many tabs in the Google Doc that it crashed multiple times and we had to create new Google Docs. One of the sort of core iteration processes was you write down a bunch of dates, maybe 3 dates per year, beginning of 2027, middle, end. And you basically say, you make lots of predictions about, I think this will happen then, this will happen then, this will happen then. Our sort of scenario forecasting work was much more robust than what we were actually able to include. You have to compromise on so many details. But then what's useful is to essentially say, these are the hoops I want to jump through in this story. These are the sort of notes I want to hit. And these are the points that I want to drop on. Having a person who's holding the pen, who you essentially, the best way I found for collaboration in this sense is you have a pen holder who is like ultimately able to say yes or no to everything, but then that person has to operate from a position of like low ego and low opinion almost, and then it's everyone trying to sort of push for them, and then they have like a low bar for consensus. And so even though internally I think we have quite a diversity around like timelines, I think we were able, because we all come from what I would describe as like the seedlings of this ideology of Europe needs to be stronger if it wants to be relevant.
Yes.
We were all able to have quite strong consensus on that. And so I think everyone's actually really happy and understands really well the trade-offs. People are able to like decouple and understand trade-offs when we make them and say like, we can't say this here because this audience would find it politically untenable. We have to make this trade-off in terms of this audience and that audience. And so there's lots of modeling of different political stakeholders and making compromises and trade-offs. And I'm sure like an intelligent reader can read it and sort of think for themselves, they've made this decision here because they didn't think this audience would like that. They possibly don't actually think this fully.
Yeah, no, that's I did notice some bits where I thought similarly. I've got it in my Readwise reader all marked up, and so yeah, I really enjoyed it. Alex, thanks so much for coming on today. Really enjoyed the conversation. I learned a lot.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. All right, give me a second. I'm gonna stop it.